Welcome to Quiz Time. I'm your Quizmaster, Sean, and I've got questions for you. 100 of them. We're going to stretch our brains a bit. We're going to keep ourselves young as much as we can. And we're going to go deeper in the recesses of our vast knowledges together. And we're talking about general knowledge. Questions to test your wits. Did you bring your wits with you? Are they about you? Well, let's have a little bit of fun. Maybe even learn some stuff. Shall we? All right. Here we go. What English monarch founded the Order of the Garter in 1348, establishing Europe's oldest order of chivalry still in existence? And the English monarch was Edward III. Which 19th century author wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle? And the 19th century author was Washington Irving. What name was given to the period of chaos in Chinese history, 1916 to 1928, when the country was ruled by competing military cliques? And that was the warlord era. What medieval astronomical instrument, consisting of a disc with a rotating overlay, was used to solve problems relating to the sun and stars? And that was the astrolabe. Which battle of 1815 ended Napoleon's rule as Emperor of France? And that was the Battle of Waterloo. What traditional Venetian boat is propelled by a standing rower using a single oar? And those are called gondolas. What technique, developed in Renaissance Italy, creates the illusion of depth by converging lines toward a single point? And that technique is called linear perspective. What 19th century music style, characterized by syncopated rhythms and improvisation, is considered the precursor to jazz? And that would be ragtime. Which medieval European trade guild included painters, sculptors, and stained glass makers? And that trade guild was the Guild of St. Luke. What term describes the early 17th century conflict that devastated the Holy Roman Empire and involved most European powers? And that would be the 30 Years' War. What 18th century Swedish taxonomist created the binomial nomenclature system for classifying organisms? And that taxonomist was Carl Linnaeus. Which historical preservation method used high concentrations of salt to draw moisture from food? And that method was salting or salt curing. What architectural element, consisting of a curved structure spanning an opening, transfers weight to supporting walls. And that element would be the arch. What was the name of the artistic movement that emerged in Zurich during World War I, rejecting logic and embracing nonsense and irrationality? And that movement was the Dada movement. What stringed medieval instrument, similar to a lute but with a flat back, was popular in European courts? And that was the cittern. What 19th century pseudo-scientific practice claimed to determine character and mental abilities by examining the shape of the skull? And that was phrenology. What term describes the 16th century Polish astronomer who proposed a heliocentric model of the universe? And that astronomer was Copernicus. What type of medieval fortification features a walled enclosure surrounding a central tower? And that fortification is a motte and bailey. What traditional Japanese color-changing dyeing technique uses carefully applied knots and bindings? And that technique is the shibori. What was the name of the secret society founded in Bavaria in 1776 that advocated Enlightenment ideals? The secret society. That would be the Illuminati. Which 19th century composer pioneered the concept of the leitmotif in his epic ring cycle operas? And that would be Richard Wagner. What term describes the late 19th century policy of acquiring colonial territories abroad to ensure raw materials and markets? And that term is imperialism. What medieval navigational instrument measured the altitude of celestial bodies to determine latitude? And that instrument was the cross staff or Jacob's staff. What European artistic style, popular from the 1890s to 1910s, featured organic, flowing lines and plant-inspired forms? And that would be Art Nouveau. Which literary device involves giving human characteristics to non-human entities? What do we call that? We call that device personification. What revolutionary 19th century surgical development dramatically reduced post-operation infections? And that development was the antiseptic technique. What term describes the 18th century Viennese style of music that emphasized clarity, balance, and formal structure? And that term would be classical. What material made from animal skin, was the primary writing surface in medieval Europe before paper became common. And that material was parchment. What diplomatic practice, established in the 17th century, provided foreign diplomats immunity from local laws? And that practice is diplomatic immunity. What is the name of the 14th century plague that killed approximately 1/3 of Europe's population? And that was the Black Death. What 19th century artistic movement sought to capture the fleeting effects of light and atmosphere? And that artistic movement was Impressionism. What type of traditional folk ballad tells stories of outlaws and criminals? And that folk ballad is called the Broadside Ballad. What medieval war machine used counterweights to hurl large projectiles? And that war machine was called a trebuchet. What type of scientific instrument developed in the 17th century measures atmospheric pressure? The 17th century instrument for measuring barometric pressure is the barometer. What historical phenomenon describes the migration of millions of Europeans to America between 1880 and 1920? That was the Great Migration, or Ellis Island era. What medieval medical practice involved cutting veins to release bad blood? Ugh. Well, they called that technique bloodletting. What 19th century American transcendentalist wrote Walden about his experiment in simple living? The author of Walden was Henry David Thoreau. What Renaissance artist technique creates dramatic light and shadow contrasts? What Renaissance artistic technique? That technique is chiaroscuro. What term describes a 19th century orchestral piece that tells a story or illustrates a non-musical idea? And that orchestral piece is a tone poem or a symphonic poem. What traditional maritime navigation method uses previous position, speed, and direction to estimate current position? And that would be dead reckoning. What medieval guild member had completed their apprenticeship but had not yet become a master? We still use that term today. That would be a journeyman. What traditional clothing item worn in various European cultures since medieval times consists of foot coverings without separate toes? And that would be hose? What 16th century religious movement, led by figures like Luther and Calvin, challenged Catholic doctrine? And that religious movement is the Protestant Reformation. What archaeological technique uses the known decay rate of radioactive carbon to determine an object's age? And that technique is radiocarbon dating. What Renaissance scientific instrument demonstrated the principles of inertia and conservation of energy? And that instrument is called Galileo's pendulum. What literary movement of the late 18th century emphasized emotion, individualism, and the beauty of nature? And that movement was Romanticism. What 19th century philosophical movement held that knowledge comes primarily from sensory experience? And that movement was called empiricism. What traditional method of food preservation involves smoking meat over smoldering wood? That method would be smoking. What ceremonial medieval event featured knights in disguise competing in armed combat? Oh, that medieval event is called the tournament or the joust. What was the primary building material for Gothic cathedrals that enabled taller, lighter structures? The primary building material was stone. What style of portrait painting, popular in the 18th and 19th centuries, featured small, detailed likenesses, often worn as jewelry? And that would be miniature. What medieval musical instrument consists of a series of tuned bells played with a keyboard? And that instrument is a carillon. What 19th century invention by Louis Daguerre created detailed images on silver-plated copper? And that invention was the daguerreotype form of photography. What architectural feature, common in Romanesque churches, consists of a semicircular recess, typically at the east end? And that would be an apse. What traditional craft involves the making of decorative objects from straw? And that would be straw plating or straw marquetry. What 19th century economic theory, developed by Karl Marx, predicted the eventual revolutionary overthrow of capitalism? That would be communism. What prehistoric monument in England, constructed around 2500 BCE, aligns with the summer solstice sunrise? And that would be Stonehenge. What medical practice, pioneered by Edward Jenner in 1796, provides immunity to disease through controlled exposure? And that would be vaccination. What 17th century conflict between English parliamentarians and royalists ended with the execution of King Charles I? And that was the English Civil War. What traditional farming practice involves planting different crops in the same field in a regular sequence? And that practice is called crop rotation. What Renaissance painter is known for works including The Birth of Venus and Primavera? And that Renaissance painter was Sandro Botticelli. What term describes the technique of writing text continuously without spaces or punctuation, common in ancient manuscripts? And that would be scriptio continua. What early 20th century art movement, founded by Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque, fragmented objects into geometric forms? And that would be Cubism. What 18th century artistic movement emphasized harmony, restraint, and classical inspiration? And that movement was called Neoclassicism. What medieval religious plays performed in town squares dramatized political stories, biblical stories? Those plays were called mystery plays. What traditional method of fabric decoration uses hot wax to resist dye in specific patterns? And that method is called batik. What term describes the 19th century Russian system where serfs were bound to the land and their landlords? That was the system of serfdom. What 15th century invention by Johannes Gutenberg revolutionized the production of books? And that invention was the printing press. What traditional instrument featuring a bellows and buttons or keys became popular in European folk music in the 19th century? That would be the accordion. What term describes the 16th and 17th century European belief that monarchs ruled by divine right? And that term is called absolutism. What colonial era American furniture style features straight lines, minimal decoration, and emphasizes utility? And that would be Shaker. What literary technique involves the main character addressing the reader directly? And the technical term for that literary technique is breaking the fourth wall. What medieval farming system divided arable land into 3 fields, with one left fallow each year? And that system is called the 3-field system. What historical period of the 1920s, marked by cultural dynamism and social change, was named after a F. Scott Fitzgerald novel? That was the Jazz Age. What natural dye, derived from the murex sea snail, produced the rare purple color worn by ancient royalty? And that would be Tyrian purple. What traditional brewing vessel, typically made of copper, is used to boil the wort during beer production? And that would be a brew kettle. What 19th century Russian novelist wrote War and Peace and Anna Karenina? And that novelist was Leo Tolstoy. What architectural feature, common in medieval castles, consists of a protective wall surrounding the main building? And that feature is called a curtain wall. What medical term describes the 19th century practice of inducing an unconscious state for painless surgery? And the term is anesthesia. What early scientific instrument, invented by Zacharias Janssen around 1590, magnifies small objects? And that scientific instrument is the microscope. What literary movement, emerging in the 1950s, featured spontaneous writing and themes of spiritual exploration? And that literary movement is the Beat movement. What traditional textile technique creates fabric by interlacing threads at right angles? And that textile technique is weaving. What term describes the system of patronage in medieval Europe, where lords provided land to vassals in exchange for their loyalty? And that would be feudalism. What 19th century artistic movement, led by William Morris, promoted traditional craftsmanship over industrial production? And that would be the arts and crafts movement. What ancient method of preserving food involves soaking it in a vinegar solution? And that ancient method of food preservation is pickling. What 19th century architectural element, made possible by new iron manufacturing techniques, allowed for larger windows and open floor plans? and that would be the I-beam or steel frame. What traditional French cooking vessel, typically made of cast iron with a tight-fitting lid, is designed for slow cooking? And that would be a Dutch oven. What musical development of the early 20th century abandoned traditional harmony and tonality? The development would be atonality. What medieval illumination technique involved applying thin sheets of gold to manuscript pages? And that technique is called gold leaf. What 18th century philosophical movement emphasized reason, individualism, and skepticism of traditional institutions? And that would be the Enlightenment. What traditional basket making technique involves weaving flexible materials around a rigid frame? And that technique is stake and strand. What historical process, beginning in 18th century Britain, marked the transition from handcraft to machine manufacturing? And that process is the Industrial Revolution. What early form of nautical navigation relied on observing known landmarks? And that form of navigation is called coastal navigation. What 19th century literary style aimed to depict contemporary life and society with realistic detail? And that literary style was called realism. What medieval game, played on a checkered board with carved pieces representing military figures, originated in India? And that game is chess. What traditional cooking method involves submerging food in hot fat? Yum! And that method is deep frying. What 19th century scientific principle states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed? And that would be conservation of energy. What architectural style, popular in 18th century Europe, featured ornate asymmetrical designs and elaborate ornamentation? And that would be Rococo. What early American folk art technique involved creating silhouettes by cutting black paper? And that technique was Scherenschnitt. What traditional method of timekeeping used the shadows cast by the sun to indicate the hour? And that would be using a sundial. Well, that's it. You've done an amazing job. Don't forget to like, subscribe, ring that notification bell, and share your score in the comments, please. And check out these videos right here. They're a lot of fun too. Thanks for playing. I'll catch you in the next one. Bye-bye.